Good evening. It's Wednesday night here in Elvins, and we have a thunderstorm rolling through, and we have all kinds of strange things happening. But this is our third YouTube observation lesson on how to study the Bible. And so, just so you know, we have set up a little classroom here in the office, and so I will flop over here to the other camera, and you see the two happy members of the class. And so in the future, here's the plan. What I would like for us to be able to do is to begin this Sunday. We're going to have a Zoom sunrise service to go with our Facebook broadcast. These are going out on YouTube. And so what I would like for us to be able to do is to begin Zoom recording a Bible study. That means that we can start participating again in the Bible study, and we can have a number of folks call in or use a smartphone or a computer or whatever it is that you have, so that you can be a part of this class, which means that I'll sort of be tied back into making it a 6 o'clock production. And what we've been doing is recording these and then uploading them later. And so we don't always upload them even on Wednesday. It hasn't been. We may be able to do a little bit better with that. But we'll be doing them with Zoom, and I will send out the invitations probably with the same connection that we use on Sunday. So that was a big, long introduction. But we don't have the same kind of music and everything that we normally have on Wednesday nights, so I guess you can afford at least a little commercial. So what I want us to see tonight, and I'm going to flip us over to the Impress show so that we can see what's happening. We had been studying Howard Hendrix, Living by the Book. And in Living by the Book, we learned several things. The first of which was that we were going to have to learn how to do Bible study in a particular sequence. And we were about to get into the 10 specific steps or rules for reading. But let me back up a little bit and say we had observation. That's the part we're in right now, where we want to say, what do I see? We can't get on to interpretation until we've done that, and we can't go on to application until we've finished the interpretation. So right now we're on 10 steps or rules for reading, because we said we needed to learn how to read better and faster. And then we talked about that at length. I'm not going to try and reproduce that, but we did say we needed to read thoughtfully. We needed to read repeatedly, and we've been over that a couple of times. One sitting, and from the beginning would be good, different translations, and patiently until we can actually find some answers, and not to quit and run to all of our secondary sources too quickly. I was thinking about this particular one. We didn't dwell on this one terribly last time, but it's true that we have to be careful to jump too far into the secondary sources before we've really figured out what it is that we want to do. And so one of the things that we do at Christmas time, we often have watched the Hallmark Christmas movies. I don't know if that's going to happen in the future with some of the trends and so forth, but one particular one that we liked because it had the Fonz on it playing a role. And so this lady is not a terribly good cook, and she decided that she's going to cook a turkey. And everybody was snowed in, and she didn't really know what she was doing. She had a guest in the house who's really a chef, and so she decides, I'm going to cook this turkey, and she launches into it. And immediately what happens She looks up some information. She's on her YouTube and watching videos and consulting the internet, and she gets a half a dozen different varieties of how to cook the turkey, and then some of them completely conflicted with one another. And then in the end of it, she didn't really do very well at cooking her turkey. So we don't want that to happen. Let me go back to our study here just a little bit. We want to find pay dirt on our own, meaning we're like that picture that we saw in the book of Proverbs, looking for the precious metals and the stones and the other things that we can do. Next, we want to talk about reading selectively, and this is where we're going to really dig into an example today, but we'll come back to this quite a bit in the future. We cannot hold all these things in our head, but this is one that I think you probably can remember to ask. We need to learn to ask who, and when we want to ask who, so what kind of who questions are we really going to ask? One is, who are the people who are involved? What is being said about these people? What do the people themselves say? What is the situation around them? What do we know about them already from other passages? Those kinds of things. Who are we talking about? What's the position that they're holding and so forth? And then we want to talk about the what. What exactly is happening in the particular passage? We also need a bigger what that gives us context and so forth. And we'll get into that a little more specifically. But what's the big idea going on here? What's happening in this passage? What is it that I'm looking at? Am I looking at a parable? Am I looking at a miracle? Is this a prophecy that's being given? What's happening in the passage? Is this a command that's being given? And is it a good guy or a bad guy who is the lead role here? Because not everything in the Bible is a good thing. They have examples of bad things just as easily. And if it's a passage that has an argument to it, what is the argument? What's the point? What is it that is trying to be communicated to us in terms of what's happening? Then we also need to ask about the where question. Where is this story taking place, if it is a story? Where's the command being given? Where's the prophecy being given? Where are the people involved? And so we may have a number of answers to some of these questions, but we need to find the answers to these. And then the when question, what time is it? Is it the morning? If it is, the morning of what day? Is it a particular month in the year? Is it the time when a festival is going on? Is it at the conclusion of something important or the beginning of something important? And then we want to ask the why question. Why has God seen fit to include this particular section of Scripture? Why did the writer include it? What reason could he have had? And sometimes that gets stated and sometimes it doesn't. Why, if we only have so many pages of God's record, these 66 love letters that he's written to us, why is this story written to us? And so we need to know those kinds of things. And then the next step in the why question, which will lead us eventually into our interpretation and application, and that is the wherefore question. These are all those standard questions that get asked, the journalistic questions, and they've served well. What difference is it going to make if you apply this truth to your life? And so that's the question we have to determine from the passage. And it's fair game to look at the surrounding context and so forth. Then we want to get back to the whole question of how else to read this passage, and we need clearly to read it prayerfully. Read it with prayer before and during and after. We want to learn how to pray. There's an awful lot in the Bible, especially the New Testament, that talks about how to pray and how not to pray. So here's a little tip for you. There is much to be gained at times from listening to other Christians pray, and that's sort of how we learn how to do many things. But that does not mean that everything will benefit you just to watch other people pray. Many times people have learned from other people who have learned from other people, and so all they know how to pray is saying the same sort of rote cliches, which amount to the same things that we were told by Jesus that the Gentiles do, thinking that they would be heard for their many words, and that's not the big idea here. So we need to figure out how to pray, which is just simply talking to God. If you want to know some of the best ways to learn, it's probably to watch little children pray. They will just say it like it is. Doesn't mean necessarily that everything they do is right, and they may have some poor motives and so forth, but they will be honest with the Lord. If you read through the Proverbs, that's probably as good a place as any. You'll see how to pray, and that's a good way to learn how to pray too, is to pray through the passages that are in the Bible. So a new convert, an adult convert, would also be a good choice there. You can turn scriptures into prayer. There's a lot. I'll probably attach a link. We just got some information this last week from Zoom call that we had with the We Preach Christ group that discussed this. So I'll give you some resources down in the notes. So when we get hung up and we can't figure out exactly what we should do with the passage and how to understand it, remember that God wants us to understand, and he wants us to ask him for help. Then we want to say we should read the Bible imaginatively. Sometimes people think of the Bible as something very dry and boring, and sometimes it's because they don't have a background, don't understand what's going on. They might not have understood some of the wording and so forth, and so that might have put them off just a little bit. We also realize that it helps. We've done this for the last few years, especially when I started teaching the Vacation Bible School segments, the Bible study segments. I don't know what happened in all the classes before, but we've been acting out a number of our Bible stories. That allows the kids to sort of see what it would be like to be in this particular position, and it puts them in a better position when you start asking questions. They have put their imagination to work and thought about what it would like. We had, for instance, last year, Jesus walking to Peter on the water. And so we had the whole auditorium set up where the blue benches, the pews that we had represented the waves, because they kind of are shaped like waves. And then the floor was the low spot, and we had a boat set up in there, and the kids got to do all these things. We had a great big blower going so that you could actually feel the wind. So not all that has to be set up and acted out, but you can do that with your mind. You can put yourself in the place of the biblical characters and the story and see what's happening here. Then we need to learn how to read reflectively or meditatively. There is probably nothing more critical. We talked about being able to chew on your spiritual cud. That's what we have to somehow reach, the point where we can absorb some text and then begin to turn it over in our minds over and over and over. And as we do, we'll be able to learn about that. If you read a passage, several places that we could look in the Old Testament. I think of Joshua, for instance, 1:8. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do all that is written in it. And then you'll make your way prosperous, and then you'll have good success. We're supposed to do that. We're supposed to be affected by the things that we read so that we can begin to learn and have our minds transformed. If you look, for instance, in Psalm 1, it says, "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor stands in the path of sinners, nor sits in the seat of the scornful, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night." So we have to learn how to do that. If you think about some of the other passages that pertain to meditation, I like particularly Philippians 4 in verse 8 that tells us to think on all these good things. And then it makes it clear in Philippians 4:9, but if we will do this, the God of peace will be with us. And so he's putting a little bait there for us to understand that there's a reason for us to do these things. Then we have to read the Bible purposefully. Going quickly here, but you can always go back and pick this up. We want to see what the purpose for the passage is. What did the author mean when he wrote these things? For instance, here we're looking at 2 Timothy 3:16 and 17. We've used this already in this study. But all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine. So is the purpose of this passage to teach us something new? For reproof, is it coming after us to tell us that we're doing something wrong? For correction, is it trying to turn us around and head us in the right direction? Or instruction in righteousness, is trying to show us how to live the Christian life once we're headed in the right direction? That the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work, that is perfected, as perfect as we're able to get in this life. So that's what we're trying to do. In some passages, we may read to the end of the book, as you do in John chapter 20 in verse 31, and find out, he says, I could have written all kinds of things. I could have written more than would fit in all the books in the world. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. Likewise, you may find a different kind of purpose statement at the beginning of the book, as in Acts, when we get our marching orders and sort of the outline for the whole book, Acts 1:8, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witness to me in Jerusalem, so that's the first part, and in all Judea and Samaria, that's the surrounding area, that's part 2, and to the end of the earth. So that's what we're to learn. And then we find out, for instance, that the first part of Acts, that he says, the former account I made, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and teach until the day in which he was taken up, after he, through the Holy Spirit, had given commandments to the apostles whom he had chosen. So what do we learn there? We just found out what the whole purpose was for the book of Luke, which was that first one. Then, ninth, we need to learn to read acquisitively. That is, we're supposed to acquire something, to receive it and to retain it. We can't just let it go in one ear and out the other. We need to learn these things, not just to perceive something in the moment, but to actually hang on to it and make use of it in the future. We're supposed to lock these things into our minds so that we can bring them to bear at any given moment. And then telescopically, we need to learn that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. We are in the process right now of repairing Freddie's wrecked automobile, and we have a lot of pieces beginning to pile up in the garage. And so when they were all one complete running automobile, it was quite a useful piece of machinery. Right now, we can't really take it out anywhere because we have it turned into a pile of parts, and it will not cease to be useless until we are able to put all these parts back together. So what I'm saying is it's good for us to have lists. It's good for us to think about all these many things that we have to do, and we do have to do them, but that's not the whole idea. What we want to do is learn how to put all the pieces together so that we are able to complete the picture, make it a whole again, and make it useful to us. Not just so we can have, 12 baskets of fragments that somebody has collected, and they're all carried down in different baskets by different people. So that gets us to the point where I can begin to include the rest of the classroom here. And so I'm going to let you have a look at them for just a moment. And so they look very happy to have been able to listen in to everything and pay attention. And then, of course, they had to be quiet because we only have a microphone sitting here recording everything. But now we get to the part where we get to do something with all of this. And so when I say telescopically, yeah, we do have to get back away from all the parts so that we can see the big picture again. And so the only way to do that is we just begin to make it a habit to put all these pieces together. So what I want us to do is to go to Mark chapter 5. We'll be back in this later, but Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 24. I'm going to show it to you here in Logos. And by the way, if you haven't gotten Logos, you want to go to the website and check on the links and apps where you can download this. You can get a free copy, and you can do a lot with it. So in this particular translation, I'm just about to finish up the New Living Translation, so I'll finally be on to read something else before too long. But you see we have the passage Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 24. And let me just go ahead and read this to you. We do have a context, and we'll get back to the context. But here's what I want us to do, and I will show us just for the time being. I will let you see our classroom here, and so I'm going to make an assignment, and you might be sitting at home all by yourself, and you can just pick one of these, or you can pick all of them. We're going to have three main characters going on in this particular portion. And so one of them is going to be Jesus. I'll go ahead and take that perspective, but we'll all discuss it. One is going to be the whole group of disciples. So Freddie is going to play the part of all the disciples. We're not going to act this out for you, but we'll be talking about these things. And then there is a woman who shows up to get some healing. And so Lydia is uniquely qualified in this group to play the part of the woman. And so here we go. I'm going to read this passage, and I want you to listen either from the Savior perspective, the disciple perspective, or the woman perspective. Jesus went with them, talking about Jairus here, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed. Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me?" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it, and then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." Okay, so we realize we have several things going on here, and I'm just going to have to launch into some of it. I set my notes aside someplace. First person I'd like to ask about is the woman, and just think what observations do you make here? What is going on? How is she feeling about these things? And just give me a perspective of how this whole scene plays out if you're the woman.
Well, she'd been sick for 12 years. She'd been to all kinds of doctors and had spent all of her money just to get better, and all it did was make her worse. And she was desperate. She had heard about Jesus and had decided that she was going to go see him and see if he could heal her.
Okay. If you've been after this problem for 12 years and you haven't found any help yet, what kind of hope do you think you're going to have approaching this situation?
Well, I think she was probably pretty discouraged up to this point, but something made her think that it was important to go see Jesus about it.
She didn't, of course, you have to know a lot of the background here, but if you think about it, somebody who is suffering from this situation, it would be considered unclean, and here Jesus is this rabbi, and so for her even to make contact with him, that would be a huge no-no in that day. And so I would say, at least it sounds like there would be a lot of fear involved as well. And you could tell that she was very reluctant to admit that she had actually done this thing. What do you think about her approach? I mean, clearly it's not something you want to go up and have a conversation in the middle of a crowded area and then find out that you're unclean and all these things. Wonder where she got the idea that it would even do any good to touch the hem of his garment.
She'd heard about all his power. I think she was just grasping at straws, hoping for a way to be healed. And the garment was touching him.
And we do read about some of these things later on. We find out about handkerchiefs and all these kinds of things. Uh, we see these things now on television, for example, and we laugh about, sending out these prayer cloths and whatever it is, as if they had power, but people were being healed in the stories that you read in the Acts. These things were really taking place, and so you'd have to wonder, how that got started and where the teaching came from. So, what about the disciples?
They strike me as kind of overbearing. They kind of want to keep Jesus, or keep the crowds away from Jesus as he's trying to walk and do this. Like he's on his way to heal somebody, and so I figure they're just wanting to clear the path, and the crowd's not having it.
So, they're on the way to heal somebody. What's the situation? What's the bigger picture that's taking place here? I realize we only read a certain number of verses, but what is the big picture here?
Jairus' daughter is sick.
And Jairus is an important character. He's a synagogue leader. And here he is. There aren't that many folks who are on Jesus' side, necessarily from the Jewish leadership. And here's a synagogue leader who is ready to accept him. And then what's the other part of what's happening there? She's pretty much at the point of death. And so if you think about the situation for her, if he doesn't get there right away, at least this would be the perception of both Jairus and the disciples. It turns out that Jesus actually knows better. She could die. As it turns out, she has already died, and they've already left the house and on their way. And so these guys are in a huge hurry, thinking that somehow they got to get on down the road and get to Jairus' house before it's too late, and they end up with some really bad press. But if you look at who they are, what did they just experience before they arrived and got tasked with getting to Jairus' house?
Well, they just saw a bunch of demons cast into pigs after they've been living in a guy.
All right, and then after the pigs stampeded off into the water and drowned, and all the townspeople showed up, what did the townspeople want Jesus to do?
They wanted to...
They were upset with Jesus because that he had just taken away their livelihood in the pig herd.
Yeah. I mean, we don't know, a couple thousand pigs. Now, who they were selling the pigs to, I don't know, because it's supposed to be a Jewish environment, but obviously it was worthwhile to them. And so you lose a herd of a couple thousand pigs, that would have to be pretty significant. They did not want that to happen again. They did not want Jesus to stick around. And so they just said, please go away. They didn't seem happy at all, but this demoniac had been healed. And then Jesus and the disciples ended up getting into the boat, and that's where we find him, with them, and the storm comes up, and so they assume that they're all going to perish, and so it had been quite a difficult night for them. And then they show up on the shore, and this crowd just begins to crowd around them and ask constantly for something. If you think about it, what else with the disciples? What are they feeling right now? Completely mobbed over with this crowd. Every single one in the crowd wanting a piece of Jesus, you might say.
Yeah, they're very overwhelmed, and I'm sure they must have been very flustered when Jesus wanted to stop and ask them who touched me, because I'm not sure there was a single person there who had touched him by that point.
If you think about this crowd, they just came from, of course, a demoniac who was just completely beyond anything that we could imagine. And then, in addition to the demoniac, they have to interact with this terrible storm, and they're out in the sea. So they have been through some pretty rough times already. But to see a crowd like this, where everybody wants a hunk of you, that had to feel a little bit like they were at the receiving end. They were down there at the water's edge, at the edge of the cliff, as the 2,000 pigs were stampeding toward them. That's what this crowd must have felt like to them. And so they were obviously a little bit uptight about that. But what else could we say the disciples might have been going through? If you think about if Jesus asks you a question like, who touched me? And you're supposed to, I think they kind of pictured themselves sort of like his handlers, his manager. He's like, he's Muhammad Ali or something, and they're the guy's his entourage who's taking care of him and supposed to keep people off, and it's obviously not working. They have failed. They can't keep people away, and now he asks them this specific question, and what answer do they have?
Well, who hasn't touched you?
So they're going to feel, what, put on the spot.
I think too that they had just seen the very first miracles that they had seen. I mean, they saw the storm, they saw the demoniac, but they're still in that mindset of, who is this? And they hadn't really thought about him being able to tell who it was that was touching him. It was just not familiar territory to them yet.
And that kind of leads us into the next subject, and that is, what is it that Jesus is feeling right now, and what's Jesus' perspective? We've already said, among other things, he knows that he's been tasked with going to Jairus' house, but he also knows something that nobody else there knows. He knows that Jairus' daughter has already died. And so, if you think about it, there's just no sense of urgency right now to get to the house. There will be, they're going to feel some more urgency when the messengers get there, so there's that end of things. Then there's also the fact that while he's on his way, this woman comes up and touches him, and there's nothing that we can relate to when it comes to he feels somehow, that's what the text says there, he feels that there's power going out of him. And so we have no idea exactly what that would be like. We will never know what that's like. It doesn't really make any difference, for us, other than to realize that this is just a God thing. And so the other thing that's taking place here is he knows that the power has gone out for a particular reason. And so what's the reason that the power has gone out?
Because it did.
Well, because it did, and why did it go out?
Because she had faith.
So she's come, whatever reason she had faith, and so you can only imagine that he has stopped in particular because he has noticed not just the power going out, but also the fact that he knows that she has faith. Now, if the power already went out, and she was already healed, and she felt that healing, and he did as well, then what would be the purpose of his stopping? Is because he wanted to make a public example of her faith. And so he was excited to see that kind of faith. He's excited when the Roman centurion says, you don't have to actually come to my place to heal my servant. You just say the word and it'll get done. And so in the same way, he realizes this woman just reached out to touch my garment, believing that I was able to do it, even if she didn't verbally ask me for it, and I didn't lay my hands on her, and didn't wave over the spot like, you hear Naaman saying that he wished Elisha had done, and say a special prayer or anything. She just believed that Jesus was able to do this thing, and without even anybody else knowing about it. And so she was rewarded for all of that. So here we are. We have spent just a little bit of time, probably more time than you imagined, and but in this little bit of time, you could picture yourself sitting down with this passage, learning some things about this passage just by asking a few questions. In this case, who's involved? We found out very quickly that we had these characters. We could also have added Jairus. We could have added the rest of the crowd that was looking on. We could have done a number of things, but it's sort of limited right now in who's participating. And then we've asked where they are and what in the world is going on at this time, why this is included. It's meant to highlight this faith and as well as Jesus' power. And we've begun to really put a handle on these things. And it isn't like we turned it into a difficult assignment. We just really were looking at the passage and coming up with these natural questions that you would want to ask. And then once we've made all these observations, we'll be ready to go on to the next step. We haven't gone there yet. We haven't made any interpretation, particularly. We've sort of been heading in that direction, and we certainly have not made any applications yet. But we have made a lot of observations, and that's the first step. And so that's what we're talking about. Next time, we will be talking about some more tools to help us think about what it is that we're looking at, how to make observations. We'll have a whole, literally a whole handful of things for us to look at next time. And hopefully we will begin to get some group participation via Zoom. And so I look forward to that. We'll see you later. Thanks.